Is the West a sex-negative society? Sounds like a dumb question, but the answer may indeed be that it is. The data certainly does show that, as counterintuitive as it may sound for those way too focused on culture war issues. Is it really a bad thing if we're a sex-negative society? My initial instinct tells me that the answer is no, but what if I'm wrong? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so let's talk about sex, and by that I don't mean the dimorphism of the human species, but the physical activity of having sex. And there goes my chances of having this video monetized. Well, tough luck, what can I say? So, this is a discussion that will get me in trouble, or maybe not. Maybe I'm just being overly pessimistic about the willingness of people to talk honestly about this. However, whether I get into trouble or not, it is a discussion that we must have, and by we, I mean people who routinely engage in this very dangerous act called thinking, and that we also belong to the so-called relatively developed world. The issue is not necessarily restricted to the developed world, mind you, but it is in the developed world where we can still afford to talk about it the most. The reason we must have this conversation is because if we don't, well, nobody's going to like the result. You know what young men who can't get any pussy tend to do? Revolution. That's what they do. You don't have to believe me, just watch the next 10 to 15 years in the People's Republic of China, where you have roughly 35 million men who, for sure, will not get any. Unless the CCP finds a way to relieve that pressure, and if they don't, the CCP itself will have to face them, and there is no gulag that can keep that pressure under control. And there are no money to buy them off either. And I'm going to start with an article written by Jacob Falkovich and published by Quillette magazine called The Sex-Negative Society. Jacob is a mathematician, so therefore he comes from a very rationalist school of thought, whether he owns up to that fact or not, which means he's pretty straightforward with this topic, which means he'll rustle some jimmies, which makes his article worthy of consideration. Now, while I will comment through this article, the worst part of this video will come once I'm done with it. So, the sex-negative society. Quote, "Sex is in trouble. Fewer of us are having it. Those who do have it, less later, and are finding it harder and less satisfying than they hoped for. The question arises, how come in our culture that is so sex positive? The mainstream culture and its myriad subcultures is sex positive is taken for granted. The demons of unwanted pregnancy and life-threatening STIs were banished by contraceptives and antibiotics. Acceptance is accepted, shaming is shamed, and what used to be hidden is now displayed in ads, movies, and Instagram accounts. Is this all sex positive? If the standard for sex positivity is simply about promoting more sex, then, as mentioned, we're failing to meet even that. Quantity and accessibility are also far from the only things we care about. We wouldn't call a culture of abundant, calorie-dense junk food a food-positive one. Wikipedia defines sex positive as an attitude towards human sexuality that regards all consensual sexual activities as fundamentally healthy and pleasurable, unquote. That sounds more like what people want. Health and pleasure, sex that feels good and that you feel good about, that leaves all participants better off, their relationships stronger, and their bodies and souls nourished. positive sex. The problem is that positive sex doesn't result from merely having an attitude that it is so. It results from cultivating skills, both physical and spiritual, and discerning those skills in others. It can be an intimidating endeavor, one that requires both instruction and encouragement. Both of those are conspicuously missing from every mainstream culture and subculture I know of. They all have their own criteria, such as consent or matrimony, to declare whether sex is permissible or not whether it's good or lousy. And when they get into the detailed aspects of sex, they focus almost exclusively on the negative ones, close quote, and can I get an amen? Yes, this is absolutely true. Now, while I disagree with the underlying tone and later on the conclusion of the author, the facts are what they are. Nobody teaches sex. I was offering consultancy on informal education to a teenager or early adult, 19, 20 years old, something like that, and he dropped a remark that he had just started his sex life with his sweetheart and just moved in with her and whatever, and I said, wow, nice, well, at least the sex is wonderful. I had no idea just how much work I had just offered myself as a result of that remark. You see, I had assumed, obviously wrongly, that just because I had parents and a mentor to teach me these things, and as a result sex at age 19, in my case, was wonderful, then surely for most 19-year-olds it must be at the very least similar. Well, it wasn't. And it was very easy for me to accept that I was wrong, but what was a lot harder for me to accept was that the difference varied so much that something else must be happening in the background that I didn't offer much thought to it. And that something else is that all of the formal and informal institutions that used to deal with this aspect have either become dysfunctional or have just disappeared without being replaced by anything. So when I pressed harder on that late teenager, I got into an aspect of individuality that I rarely gave much thought to. And perhaps it's because I never needed to. Even though I spent several years writing anti-feminist propaganda and coordinating agitprop and activism with a view to undermine feminist ideology in institutions, I never approached that one either from a distinctly sex-positive perspective, but rather from a liberty or anti-totalitarian perspective, namely the liberty to be sex-positive or sex-negative, the liberty to choose without the state minding your business, and the liberty to function without totalitarian interference via terrible ideas such as feminism. Also, as a tactic, I approached anti-feminism as any propaganda battle, namely with the usual tools, undermining their institutions via subversion and radicalism, targeting their most successful shills and inflicting personal consequences upon them, and of course, counter-propaganda that cast as wide their net as possible. Going explicitly with a sex-positive view would have been counterproductive, so I don't regret having acted the way I did, but I do wonder whether that perspective, the sex-positive one, would have been helpful to some of the individuals in trouble that I met along the way. And the reason I wonder this is because teenagers of today are just way too different than the teenagers of the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s. Now, that in itself wouldn't be a terrible thing if that were to bring them extra happiness, but it doesn't. And sexual energy being one of the primary drivers of all human beings, or okay, almost all, a bunch of sexually frustrated teenagers are for sure going to be a huge problem for civilization itself. As Hannah Arendt correctly identified, every generation civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. And as Thomas Sowell correctly added, those little barbarians must be civilized before it's too late. Both Sowell and Arendt were referring to various values about a free society, yet this remark is also true for how to regulate sexuality, and as a civilization, we're not doing a great job at all. In fact, we're heavily going in a very wrong direction. So, let's read some more to see Falkovich's thoughts. Quote, Conservatives are sex negative. They talk about sex as dangerous and corrupting, to be repressed and regulated for the sake of social order and family values. Traditional Christianity promises that sex would be divine if you just wait until marriage and are heterosexual, monogamous, and not too kinky, but offers little guidance on how to actually make it so, or what to do if the virgin newlyweds discover that the sexualities they've kept bottled up until their happy day are less than compatible, unquote. Well, yes, in fact, most often I do get into trouble with my conservative friends precisely when I point out just how unhealthily sex negative way too many conservatives are. As for Falkovich's remark about traditional Christianity, well, I beg to differ. The Songs of Solomon, or the Song of Songs in the Bible, is quite literally erotic literature. So traditional Christianity is most definitely not sex negative wholesale. Unfortunately, however, many Christian denominations have bent quite a lot with the times, and that is kinda terrible. This is easily observed by anyone who seriously takes time to look at the details of how Christianity is practiced in North America and some portions of Western Europe versus how it's practiced in Eastern Europe. You see, in Eastern Europe, be it Catholic Poland or Orthodox Greece, it is not only quite common but openly encouraged to ask for advice and guidance in sexual matters from your spiritual advisor. In Eastern Europe, it is still, to this day, quite common for people to seek to maintain some relationship with a priest that they deem worthy enough not only to perform various religious rites, but indeed to be a confessor and an advisor on many things in life, including sexual matters. Now, admittedly, in the Orthodox world, it also helps that the priests are married, and they stop being priests if they divorce. So the priest himself has a very strong incentive to maintain a proper relationship, including sexually, with his wife. So that means the priest may indeed be very knowledgeable and therefore able to provide decent advice and/or guidance to other people as well. This is why, at least in theory, priesthood is considered a very difficult job, at least priesthood done right. This, however, is a lot less present in the Protestant world and also in the countries that remain only nominally Catholic. The decline of organized religion is not a good or a bad thing per se. It only becomes a problem if the services, structure, and wisdom that it offers aren't properly replaced with something of a similar value and function. And when it comes to this particular aspect, it's clear that it hasn't been replaced properly for many people. We don't need the church to tell us why it rains or why it doesn't rain anymore. But while I don't need the church to tell me how to sex, well, some might. Anyway, let's go further. Quote, "Progressives are sex negative. They support displays of sexuality, especially by women and sexual minorities, but often place the act itself under suspicion of harassment, grooming, exploitation, or myriad other forms of endlessly traumatizing violence. The Dworkinian view that any heterosexual intercourse is an extension of the general domination of women by men is present as an undercurrent in a lot of feminism, even where it's not explicitly stated. One gets the sense that in a progressive utopia, everyone flaunts their sexuality as an identity marker, but no one goes so far as to actually flirt or sleep with anyone." Red-pilled men are sex negative. They frame sex not as a positive experience itself, but primarily as a way to keep score in the competitive hierarchy of men. This view is shared both by incels, who fatalistically accept their place in that hierarchy's or mom's basement, and the self-styled alpha gurus of the manosphere telling their disciples how sex is a tool used by women to deprive men of their vitality and income. Pickup artists learn vulgar tricks to sleep with desperate women who pretend to fall for them, neither side having any respect for the other or investment in the quality of the other's experience. Men going their own way are also sex negative, but at least they never pretend otherwise. Politicians are sex negative, looking mainly for bits of sexual expression to outlaw or regulate when they're not engaged in their own sex scandals, and especially when they are. Corporate culture is sex negative. The ideal worker has been scared out of flirting with anyone at work and stays in the office too late to flirt with anyone outside it. The education system is sex negative, especially when it engages in sex education, unquote. And again, can I get a bloody amen? Now, the fact that progressives are sex negative is something that I discussed multiple times on this channel over the last 6 years, so I won't get into that again. Of course progressives are sex negative, it's part of their identity. Remove sex negative from progressives and progressivism itself collapses. Red pill men overall, however, are not sex negative. But MGTOWs are, so are the so-called pickup artists and incels. Now, some of that is toxic indeed, but some of it is as a result of a culture that up until a few years ago was ferociously dominated by sex-negative progressives. And the road towards a post-progressive society is long. Very long. Teenagers of today will be a sacrificed generation in this regard unless they're taught very young how to reject the very fundamentals of progressivism, which unfortunately many of them aren't. However, the author is entirely correct on the corporate culture, the politicians, and the education system. And that's because all three are influenced heavily by political lobbying. Sexual harassment laws are made by politicians influenced by various pressure groups. And those laws end up governing corporate culture, and any corporation will try to cover their ass. The so-called sex ed in schools is also governed ultimately by politicians who are, of course, influenced by various pressure groups, be they conservative or leftist. And not only most conservatives and most leftists are fundamentally sex negative, but the loudest ones, the ones so interested in politics that they join a pressure group and are interested enough that they will write petitions, file lawsuits, and attend hearings, those tend to be the most sex negative. Now, that in itself shouldn't be a problem, but it ends up being a problem because there are very few sex-positive alternatives. And most of those that did exist are either flattened today or ceased to exist over the last decade. In other words, it is even more difficult to find proper guidance and mentorship on sex as a 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old now than it was 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. And that is terrible. Let's carry on. Quote, "The media is sex negative. Its prurient interest is mainly in sex that violates law or consent norms, or that at the very least is miserable and traumatizing. If Aziz Ansari had been a skilled and generous lover who left his paramour ecstatic with pleasure and emotionally elevated, no paper would ever print that story. Since his date's sexual experience was thoroughly negative, it was front page. Capitalism knows that sex sells, but it's not selling you on sex. You're sold on sex appeal, the trappings that make your peers and you see yourself as worthy of sex. Sex worthiness is sold in many ways: luxury watches, luxury dresses, luxury degrees, luxury beliefs. People can fall into narcissistic obsession with acquiring sex worthiness that entirely precludes actual intimacy. Even if that fate is avoided, the effort spent on acquiring sex worthiness isn't spent on connecting with intimate partners. Good sex doesn't contribute to any brand's sale metrics or any nation's GDP, unquote. Now that's a great example with Aziz Ansari. Not only because it was a case that resolutely showed what was wrong with the Pound Me Too movement, but it also shows just how much lack of proper guidance about sex there is out there. The author is also correct that capitalism doesn't sell you on sex, but on sex appeal. However, what the author is missing is that capitalism isn't supposed to be either sex negative or sex positive. Capitalism is supposed to be the tool that allocates resources the best depending on the preferences of individuals engaged in the market. If individuals vote with their wallet against sex positivity, and they do, then capitalism will adjust the resources in that direction. The fact that this is happening also highlights a bigger issue, namely that those who say they are sex positive are either incompetent at delivering that to the market, or they are engaged in various deceptive practices. Now, in my opinion, it's most likely a bit of both. Those who sell the political message of sex positivity are clearly engaged in a deceptive practice, since most of those selling sex positivity as a political message tend to be regressive leftists. And those who sell all sorts of sex-related items on the market are either incompetent or they simply don't care about this particular subtopic at all. Which is fine. Nobody has an obligation to care about any topic, least of all a controversial one that most likely is also quite marginal for now. Anyway, let's carry on. Quote, "Perhaps it makes no sense to expect sex positivity of any culture at all. If culture is simply the set of stories people tell themselves to get along collectively and establish order and hierarchy, it has no room for the private and disorderly affair of sex." Camille Paglia takes this further, imagining most of Western art and philosophy as a defense against the chaotic, filthy, and demonic nature of intercourse. Civilization was always a way to control sex, not to promote it. If culture was always sex negative, what has changed? One difference is that today cultures pretend to be sex positive merely because they are sexually permissive. But it turns out that lack of permission was never the main impediment. Boundaries can be a guide as often as an obstacle and a guardrail against sex that isn't healthy and pleasurable, regardless of attitude. But in a sexually indulgent culture, failure to indulge places the blame on the individual, absolving society. The celibate, especially younger men and older women, are more commonly subjected to scorn rather than compassion, unquote. Yeah, let's stop here, because this is where the author is really onto something. So, yeah, actually, yeah, it is undoubtedly true that civilization is a way to control sex, not to promote it. Though, to be more precise, the purpose is to channel sex, not to restrict it altogether. This nuance is still lost on many who fancy themselves as intellectuals or thinkers or whatever. Joseph Daniel Unwin, in his 1934 books called Sex and Culture, more or less demonstrated that successful civilizations controlled sexual energy somehow, either via constraints on women through law, or constraints on men through religion, usually deistic, or through a combination of the two. In fact, more often a combination of the two was employed. Keep in mind that Unwin was a leftist, and he didn't really like the result of his study, as he believed men and women are equal, which in itself is a luxury belief, and lacking appropriate caveats and nuances is a fundamentally wrong belief, as more and more women are finding out the hard way these days. But where Mr. Falkovich really hits a nerve is when he says that lack of permission was never the main impediment, and that is kinda true. And it's easy to figure out, he has a point, through any censorship analogy. So for instance, he says that, boundaries can be just as much as a guidance as an obstacle. Here's another analogy. For instance, up until about 50 years ago, showing a passionate kiss in a movie was haram. Cursing was also kinda haram in most countries, and controversial issues were definitely haram. Things were even worse on this side of the Iron Curtain, where the communist authorities would ban anything that would make the party look bad. Yet, with all of that censorship, lots of masterpieces emerged. When you can't outright say that the Polish United Workers' Party is dictatorial and schizophrenic, you need to use your creativity to criticize it and get that published. Juliusz Machulski did exactly that with his masterpiece movie Sex Misha, or Sex Mission, a 1984 Polish movie that you all must see if you haven't already. It's a movie that successfully manages to criticize the martial law era communist regime in Poland. It also brutally mocks feminism, and perhaps very important for the present day and age, it also brutally mocks scientism. And relevant for this talk, the movie also promotes a sex-positive view without being vulgar or leftist or hedonistic. And that is hard to accomplish. Now, make no mistake, I'm not making the argument that restrictions generate creativity of such high caliber, but I am saying that the existence of restrictions is not always the problem, especially when it comes to art, or in the case of this talk, to a fulfilling sex life. I'll get back to that. In the meantime, let's wrap this article up. Quote, "Another change is that culture is more ubiquitous and invasive. If people used to learn about sexuality from their friends, now these interactions are being replaced by interactions with influencers on social media. Porn, Hollywood, magazines, and the various internet subcultures with their sexual ideologies are impossible to avoid outside the Amish village. Society invades and turns sex into a game of identity, consumption, political affiliation, and narcissism. There are sex-positive subcultures. They usually keep themselves and are kept a good distance away from the mainstream. That's where sex-positive art is found as well. Not in superhero blockbusters where everyone is beautiful and no one is horny, but in indie movies about getting an office job, in French pop songs, in pre-modern Japanese shunga art, when you see art made by someone who was inspired by sex and not inspired by trying to sell you sex. That's when you know. The path to positive sexuality can start in one of these subcultures, but it's usually a private and difficult journey. Perhaps the right attitude to embark on it is counterintuitively that sex by default is weird and intimidating, and that you, by default, are not good at it. Perhaps from this beginning you can make some progress. One evening I went on a date, and after we finished making love for the first time, she asked me, what could I do better or differently next time? It was an epiphany to me. Not just the attitude of curiosity and improvement, but also the vulnerability that it takes to ask and answer this question. I'm sure that this question is asked in hundreds of bedrooms each night by people wiser than me, but I wouldn't see it in newspapers, in blockbuster movies, on influencer, Instagram, or on Pornhub. Sex positivity is wonderful and very possible, but it's always countercultural, close quote. Alright, well, this is a difficult topic indeed. Now, the author has a point with the superhero blockbusters where nobody is horny, but that also happens because, sadly, way too many superhero blockbusters of today lack imagination and creativity. Are basically remakes of children's stories, which of course do not and did not contain such elements, and for good reason. The author also makes a good point with the French pop culture and generally specifically pop songs, which is probably why I find it very difficult to understand this particular issue, because, well, you know, my native tongue is Romanian, and my country has been influenced by French culture all the time over the last 150, 200 years, whatever. And as a result, you know, some notions that Anglophones might consider acts of sex positivity, they just come as very natural and obvious things to do here, whereas in the Anglosphere would be considered assault or harassment or whatever. In fact, I was even joking recently with someone, a lady, a slightly older lady, a lawyer, who had just been to Paris, and it was like, oh, finally some proper men, and I was thinking, yeah, well, if you had been in London, you would have been considered harassed. So yeah, there are these kinds of fundamental differences, and perhaps this is also why continental Europe views these things a little bit more moderately, and definitely more moderately than the Anglosphere and the Islamic world. But this topic is difficult precisely because the polarization on this issue is fully schizophrenic, in the sense that none of the so-called acceptable points of view is mentally sane. For instance, the group that talks the most about being innovative in the bedroom is the group that deals with sex toys, swinger clubs, and other marginal places which rarely, if ever, attract normal people. And by normal people, I mean people in the statistical norm. As a statistical norm, people are not into exhibitionism, orgies, and other practices that are mainstream inside the subcultures that do talk about being innovative in the bedroom. And that's a shame, because discussions about innovation in the bedroom are highly important for the majority as well, not just the minority engaged in various fetishes that are, quite frankly, repulsive to the majority, and for good reason. The group that talks the most about being sex positive, as we already established, is also a very sex negative group in practice, namely feminists and progressives. In Eastern Europe, we have plenty of not so savory terms for feminist women who shout about how empowered they are, whilst all men naturally keep a decent distance from them. And again, for good reason. And the group that should be the most calculated about these things, namely the conservatives, is overwhelmingly sex negative because they don't want anything to do with the other two groups. And here's where we should do better, and I believe we can do better. Yes, it is perfectly reasonable not to want to have anything to do with either feminists and progressives and on matters related to sex, or with the weird fetishist crowd, which to a conservative looks like it trivializes sex beyond what conservatives can tolerate. However, it is not reasonable for conservatives to routinely join the far left in promoting fear-mongering about sex, particularly teenage sex. Here's an example of what I mean. In 2008, a lady aged 30 named Denise Harvey had sex with a 16-year-old with whom she developed a relationship. In 2011, she got indicted for sexual assault, even though she was still in a relationship with the so-called victim, now aged 19. In 2014, she was sentenced to 30 years in jail for 5 counts of unlawful sex with a minor. She ran to Canada before being sent to jail and was the first American in decades to be granted refugee status. Last time the story was given any attention was in 2015, when she was still living with the so-called victim. She got asylum in Canada because, as insane as Canada usually is in many aspects, the Migration Board still used common sense and basic law, namely that no Canadian law had been broken and that a 30-year sentence is just downright wrong and, yes, oppressive. Now, you can say, and you would very likely be correct, that Denise Harvey got a bit lucky and her request has been granted because she's a woman. But that's slightly off topic. I honestly don't care either way. I just use this example to highlight just how extreme the world is today, with very few pockets of moderation still standing. On one hand, you have the Islamic extreme, where ages of consent can go as low as 9 de facto, and with rigorous enforcement such as the jirgas in Pakistan and Afghanistan, imposing insane sentences like lapidating 13-year-olds for dishonor by refusal. And on the other hand, you have the extremes in the Anglosphere, where ages of consent are 17 or above, also with rigorous enforcement such as 13 years jail sentences for things that no sane person would view as criminal. Both are terribly wrong ways to approach this. The former creates an endless cycle of abused individuals, obviously, and the latter creates an entire generations of frigid people. And the data bears this out. The Anglosphere in particular, and the West more broadly, is having less sex than ever, and the decline among teenagers and young adults is the steepest of all. Now, there are positive aspects to this, of course. Decline in very young motherhood, fewer abortions, and fewer STDs. That is absolutely great. However, nobody wants to talk about the negative trade-offs that are increasingly visible and will become a very serious issue another 10 or 15 years down the road. And by that time, very few will even remember how it all started. One of the negative trade-offs is that despite the ubiquity of sexualized depictions, teenagers and young adults are less educated on sex than previous generations. But perhaps the most obvious negative trade-off is the visible increased inability of teenagers and young adults to relate to other humans, especially of the opposite sex, but oftentimes the phenomenon is generalized. For now, the data is still murky on this topic, but anyone over the age of 35 watching this video who works with 20-somethings or late teens has noticed this. way too many young adults are increasingly awkward in public and, dare I say, maladapted. And while the issue seems to be affecting young men more than young women, there has been a steep rise in awkward and maladapted young women as well. Now, make no mistake, weird, awkward, and maladapted youngsters have been around since forever, but while in any 12th grade in the year 1990 you'd find one, maybe two per classroom, today you'll find at least 5. Don't believe me? Go and observe yourself. And the sanitary fascism, under the excuse of the Wuhan flu, has only made things a lot worse, and the consequences for that will be felt many years to come, because many present-day 18-year-olds are in fact stuck at 15 or 16, and many of them will never close that gap and will become 20-somethings and indeed 30-somethings still stuck in their late teens. Again, this issue has been around for many years, but it got exacerbated with the pandemic. Okay, but so what? Many of you will rightfully ask, well, so what? Yeah, teens are having less sex, but how's that a bad thing and why should we care? Well, first of all, it's not universally a bad thing. As I said earlier, this brought a decline in STIs, teenage pregnancy, and the incidence of abortion, so there are positives coming out of this situation. However, having less sex when you're young also means less time for experimentation, and thus a higher chance of under-fulfillment later on in life. You see, teenage years have always been, and by always I mean always, since times immemorial, the period in which the individual gets to experiment with dangerous behaviors whilst enjoying the privilege of lower consequences. This is true in all aspects of socialization, not just sex. There are, for instance, roughly 0 consequences of getting really drunk at the age of 15. The body is strong enough not to develop long-term side effects. The hangover is a source of fun for one's peers who poke fun at you, and it's a valuable lesson about limits. And that's it. You don't get fired, you don't lose respect in the community because you're 15, you didn't even have the time to create any respect in the community to begin with. You don't risk ruining a future opportunity because, again, you're 15, nobody really takes you seriously anyway. And you don't risk permanently upsetting some of your peers because they're also 15, 16, 17 as well, and they'll get over it. Now compare that to those getting really drunk and knowing their limits at the age of 30. Now that's Americans who come to Europe for you. And I mean it. Americans who move to Europe at the age of 30 end up behaving like 15-year-olds when it comes to alcohol, as a statistical norm, of course. There are exceptions. The same is true when it comes to sex. If pregnancy is successfully avoided, the consequences of teenage sex are routinely much lower at age 16 or 17 than at age 30. The likelihood of catching an STD from a fellow 16 or 17-year-old is much lower than from a 30-year-old, statistically speaking. Again, this shouldn't be shocking news. And both for young women and for young men, it can be a learning experience. The young man will be less harshly judged by his partner for underperforming at age 17 than he would be at age 37. And the young woman will also be less harshly judged by her partner at age 17 than she would have been at age 37. The steep decline in teenage sex affects men and women differently and at different times in their lives, but neither sex is spared of the negative consequences. As Mr. Falkovich correctly notes, young men and older women who have little or no access to sex are met with derision and scorn rather than compassion, which is a fact that is idiosyncratic to a culture that claims to be sex positive. In reality, of course, this fact isn't idiosyncratic because the present-day culture is not sex positive at all, but is in fact more sex negative than the allegedly repressive times of the 1950s, 60s, or even the 1980s. I mean, heck, My parents' generation, for instance, was legally forbidden from accessing contraceptives. Yes, in my country, contraceptives were de facto banned until 1990. Abortion was also punished by long jail sentences, and sexually explicit material was also rare and also illegal. Yet somehow, as teenagers and 20-somethings, they had more sex, statistically speaking, than the age group 16 to 24 today. Why does this matter? Well, think about it this way. Women have a limited time window for finding a partner with whom to procreate. Yet the only role models that the culture provides are the slut hookupper who rationalizes her whoredom through a narrative of empowerment, or the purely chaste virgin who really has no idea what she wants, likes, or tolerates in the bedroom. Both of these archetypes are toxic if there is no institution or other source of trust to mitigate the upcoming problems. As I was saying earlier in the video, at least in the past the church would get involved when the newlyweds or even older couples had troubles in the bedroom. Now, not so much. Or even worse, there's all sorts of weird neo-Protestant denominations whose views about sex and sexuality are so deranged that they make even the progressives sound slightly less mental, and that's hard to achieve. For young men, it's even worse. The girls in your age bracket aren't interested in you anyway, and it's rarely the case that anyone teaches you not only how to approach older women, but also why it may be a good idea to do that. Now, admittedly, for young men, things get slightly better as they age, but if nobody teaches them to get rid of the timidity and indeed oftentimes the outright shame that they acquired during teenage years that today involve a lot less sex, then things won't get much better with age either. Sure, they'll have better access to sex as they age, but they won't get much fulfillment in their sex lives. And here's another issue. There's not much study or discussion, honest discussion, for real, not ideological platitudes, about sexual fulfillment. It is simply assumed that if one has access to sex, then surely one is also sexually fulfilled. But that's just not true. If that had been the case, then surely sex workers would have been the most sexually fulfilled people on earth. Yet they rarely are. Any interview with a sex worker will confirm this. So the issue faced is twofold: a sharp increase in people not having sex at all when they should be, and the cohort of people that isn't enjoying it. And the reason you should care is because sexual energy is a primary force, and if it is improperly managed, it blows up at the civilizational scale, and it almost always blows up in unpredictable ways. And notice that I said managed, because that's what's supposed to be happening. Repressing sexuality or pretending it's not an issue are not ways to manage it, but a dereliction of responsibility. And like with many other aspects related to demographics, there's a long inertia. You don't see these sex-negative trade-offs in 1, 2, or 5 years after the balance is ruined. These only become apparent in decades. And to make things worse, once you start addressing the issue, the positive trade-offs also take decades to become apparent. I gave the example at the beginning of this video with the CCP. Decades of one-child policy cannot and will not be turned around by the recent announcement by the CCP on May the 31st, 2021, when they said Chinese folks are now encouraged to have 3 children. Well, tough luck. The populace doesn't care. And besides, who will have 3 children when basic mathematics tells you you have over 30 million young men who will never get married and have children? It's impossible. Not to mention the Chinese bias against old women, which further adds to the problem. Because, as I said, the phenomenon dubbed by academics as the sex recession is not only in the developed world, it's almost everywhere. To various degrees, of course, which will lead to quite different outcomes depending on other factors as well, such as the level of overall repression, pre-existing cultural biases, and so on and so forth. But all of that is already baked into the cake, as it were. If there will be a reckoning on this topic, which quite frankly I do not expect, that would also show its results after the year 2050, which means that 1 or 2 generations are facing misery. You know, it's kind of like in that meme, weak men create hard times, you are here. Now, it's not all doom and gloom, mind you. For the first time in 50 years, this year, the number of intact families raising their biological children is on the rise in the United States and in almost all of Europe. And that's coming after several years in a row when the decline of normal families had stopped and the curve had stayed flat. This is good news, usually, because again, usually individuals coming from stable families not only had more stable but also more fulfilling sex lives. This may sound counterintuitive because the mainstream has been very busy for decades in promoting marginal cases of families where sexual repression was the norm. But it's obvious that wasn't the case in general because the data shows superior results in periods of generalized family stability and inferior results over the last 20 years, which is a period of increased instability. Okay, so now what? We identified the problem, we described it, though I'm pretty sure that by the time I publish this video, I will notice that I might have missed something. But now what? Well, there isn't much wiggle room, but there is more of it than it would seem at the first glance. There isn't much space for institutional approaches because many institutions are still controlled by, well, the sex-negative left. The tide is slowly turning on that too, but it took them 100 years to get there, so it will take another 30 at the very least until it will be a visible change. However, there is a lot of space for individual approaches, as well as approaches in small groups and indeed small institutions. I asked at the beginning of this video, is it really a bad thing if we're a sex-negative society? Probably not, I would say, but maybe, I don't know. What is becoming increasingly clear is that while a sex-negative civilization is and has consistently been pretty normative, there used to be some caveats to that no longer exist. And that's where the work could and should be focused, to make those caveats happen once again. Clearly, we didn't really need permission to talk about sexually explicit matters in public, and while that didn't particularly hurt, it did, perhaps inadvertently, remove something useful alongside with removing a taboo that apparently didn't matter. What it removed was the support structure on how to find out and try out things. In the past, the individual would naturally expect to learn some of these things from the parents, from friends, a mentor, the priest maybe, and through experimentation. Now? Well, now you're just supposed to know it. And if you don't, it's your fault. And if you're misinformed, it's also your fault. Essentially, nobody takes responsibility anymore. The individual rightfully asks, well, I would take responsibility, but nobody teaches me because nobody wants to. And society usually responds, well, we supported so-called sex ed initiatives, now leave us alone, without doing the necessary follow-up, which would reveal that those so-called sex ed initiatives are useless at best or downright harmful at worst, and almost never useful. Because it isn't how to use contraceptives that our youngsters need to learn. Such information was available in brochures even 50 years ago. What our youngsters might badly need to learn is how to get to that point to use them. How do you go about from the first thought of, well, I think I want a sexual partner, and all the way to the moment of, shit, I forgot to buy condoms, be right back. The information gap between these 2 points is daunting. People, and young people in particular, are given all sorts of information on desire and lust, necessary information, mind you, but still marginal to the overall process, and then all sorts of information about the mechanics and the technical aspects of sexuality, but nothing in between these 2 steps. Now, I don't pretend to know the answers to this. I've just started thinking about this issue. Hopefully in a year or so I might start having some answers. Definitely I need to speak with people who've studied this for longer than I did. The purpose of this video is rather to kickstart the conversation, and I know it's a very difficult one. And it's a difficult one both on the right and on the left. For different reasons, both sides of the aisle have made any discussion about this issue haram outside of the abuse angle. And that is not healthy. Sex isn't inherently abusive, nor is it something to be ashamed of. And we have to get the hell out of this conversational vortex and move towards a more mentally sane approach. Now, I don't purport to know how that approach will look like, but I do know we will have to think about it. Not for ourselves. I mean, it's been decades since I haven't been a teenager, so it's not like it affects me directly and personally, but for our children and for our younger friends. And make no mistake, this isn't an issue just for men or just for women. Just because it affects the sexes differently, it doesn't mean half of the human race gets to ignore this issue. No, you don't. The culture that figures this one out the fastest stands a better chance of dominating the next century. And I realize this may sound hyperbolic, but I mean it. Because you can have the best technology the human mind can imagine. If your civilization is sexually frustrated and the opponent civilization is not, the other will win out in the end. Which, by the way, also partially explains the ascendancy of certain forms of Islam. The ones that don't use jirgas to manage this, that is. Anyway. Or, alternatively, I'm wrong and Jacob Falkovich is wrong, and in fact the problem either doesn't exist or it's much smaller and there is no point in thinking profoundly about this issue. And hopefully it will pass all by itself. Hey, it's possible. It's unlikely, but it's possible. So, what do you think? Let's discuss this, because whatever the conclusions we may reach, they might prove themselves to be useful, at least individually, if not on a civilizational scale. Now, given that it's a dangerous topic, you can write to me via email if you don't want anyone else seeing your thoughts on the matter. Help me understand the issue and hopefully I'll be able to help back. After the Moldova tour, I will try for sure to get some interviews on the matter. Anyway, with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Visit our website. Regular donors are kindly asked to join the donor circle on Telegram, where we toy with a lot of dangerous ideas. And I will see you all very soon, as I'm soon getting to Moldova. On the Freedom Alternative, cheers!